Welcome to this webinar.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yes, my name is John Gibson. I will act as the host and moderator for this webinar tonight, although I will not be the main speaker by any means. I simply want to introduce myself briefly for those of you who do not know me. I am a co-founder of Earth Charter Indiana. We organized informally as an association back in 2001. It was inspired by the Earth Charter, which had come out just a year before. At first, we started holding annual summits to let people know about this fabulous set of principles and values that will guide us into a sustainable future on planet Earth. Then in 2003, we took the step of formally organizing as a not-for-profit corporation, and we call ourselves Earth Charter Indiana. Then in 2006, we launched our first major project called Sustainable Indiana 2016. It was intended to be a 10-year run-up to the bicentennial, and our mission was to discover and showcase examples of Earth Charter values and principles in action through various projects that were initiated by Hoosiers around the state of Indiana. And so we've been working on that for 7 years now, and I'm pleased to say that we have over 150 great examples of what the Earth Charter looks like in action on the ground. Now, these can also be called climate solutions because all of them reduce our carbon footprint, and all of them make some contribution toward what we call adapting to climate change that we cannot turn around at this point. So one of our aims by having these webinars is to let others of you who are on a line tonight to learn more about what's going on with this initiative in Indiana. And to help with that, I want to introduce our new executive director, Jim Poyser. Jim is a lifelong Hoosier. He was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana. He graduated from Bloomington with a double major in English and telecommunications. He started out his career as a freelance journalist and very shortly was hired by Nouveau to be its art director. Then after a few years, his skills were promoted to be the managing editor of Nouveau, where he served until just recently, when, because of his deep passion for climate solutions, he took leave of Nouveau and answered the call of Earth Charter Indiana to become its executive director. Jim, of course, as you well, you may not be able to see this if you're not in front of your computer monitor, but Jim is a member of the Society of Environmental Journalists. He's a member of the Society of Professional Journalists. He's a graduate of the Democracy School and also a graduate of the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. And he's a co-creator of Apocadox. So Jim, welcome to this new role. And I think we might just get started by you telling all who are listening, what motivated you to make this, I would say, fairly dramatic shift in your career, and where do you see the urgency that led you to it?
You bet. Well, thank you so much, John, and welcome to everybody listening. I'm a newbie to webinars, so this is an exciting technology for me. Actually have a phone now where this can be possible, and I'm real glad we didn't drive all our Hummers to one spot to meet. There's certainly a lower carbon footprint. So appreciate everybody being here, and you might already tell I like to joke it up a little bit. In fact, recently I decided that I'm an eco-tainer because I like to use some comedy in my climate presentations. But I'm struck too by something, John. Before I answer that question, you know, you talked about me being a lifelong Hoosier and growing up in northern Indiana like I did, and then at 18 leaving for southern Indiana, Bloomington, and then moving to Indianapolis in the mid-'80s. Back when there wasn't much of a place to Indianapolis. I'm struck by the kind of the onus, the negative connotation sometimes about being in Indiana for one's whole life, and there's a lack of adventure, perhaps, connotation that, oh, I never moved to New York City to try my hand at playwriting, or I never moved to Los Angeles, or I never moved to Montreal, or lived in a foreign country or whatever. And the remarkable thing about this new position is I really just get this wonderful sense of hindsight now, that what great sense it made for me to stick it around in Indiana all this time, because in my new capacity at Earth Charter Indiana, we have a statewide organization and a very specific effort that we'll talk about a bit more in this conversation that we're having, you and I, John, with, I guess, some input from our listeners as well, that I look forward to questions and comments. But to your question, I would say that it's probably the most organic thing I've ever experienced in my life to become just increasingly alarmed by what was happening to the planet. You mentioned Apocadox. Apocadox is actually a website I co-created about 6 years ago. And my co-creator, best friend from college, Michael Jensen, who lives in Nova Scotia, we basically created a project so that we could just hang out more online and occasionally in person. So there wasn't a whole lot of, let's create a website so we can face the horror of climate change. We both knew what was going on a bit, but we started this website for other reasons. But as soon as we started doing this on a daily basis, we realized that actually, instead of the fog of denial and the let's just go to the mall and not think about this kind of attitude of Indiana and beyond, we actually began to discover that climate change wasn't some distant phenomenon, but was in fact happening all over the planet, and that people were deeply wrestling, especially people in poverty, deeply wrestling with the impacts of climate change. So pretty quickly in the beginning of those years, so like 2006, 2007, 2008, it really was this time of reckoning, of realizing that we were much further down the road to ruin because of climate change than I had anticipated. So over the next couple of years, I just got more and more involved in paying attention to it and trying to find sort of entertainment modes. My background is as a playwright. And then a little over a year ago, I took the Climate Reality Leadership Core training in San Francisco with Al Gore, the Inconvenient Truth documentary turned slideshow. I was with 1,000 people from 58 countries, and it was a revelatory experience to be in a room with that many people who got it, quote unquote, people who did not need to be convinced that climate change was real and that things were unraveling very quickly in certain parts of the world and nigh on unraveling in the rest of the world. So I came back to Indianapolis with that slideshow, began to present that slideshow in November of last year, and as they say, I caught the bug. I started off, it was very awkward. to be working with PowerPoint. I'd never done it in my life. I didn't know when to talk or when to let the slides talk. I was just very awkward with it, and pretty quickly fought through that fear, got acclimated to it, and then started visiting retirement homes and churches and art galleries. But what really got me, John, and you listeners, what really turned it for me was last April when I presented in a high school, for Buff High School, and then about 5 days later I went to CFI, IPS number 2, downtown Indianapolis, so it was 5th graders. And then a couple weeks after that I was at a Sycamore with 4th graders. And that was the turning point for me, because I thought, well, you know, I can deliver these climate reality slideshows to adults all I want, but reaching the kids is a more fruitful endeavor to talk to them about what's really happening, because they may not be getting that instruction, and more importantly, to talk about the climate solutions that John mentioned earlier. Now, the magic of how that all turned into a job can be the subject for another webinar another day, because that was really quite extraordinary, that I am now in a situation of working shoulder to shoulder with John Gibson, who I met over 25 years ago, and has been a person that I've looked up to all these years and a mentor to me, so that we're now working together on Earth Charter and Sustainable Indiana. It's just a great privilege and a delight for me.
Well, thank you, Jim. That's a great introduction. And I might say that it was quite amazing. I won't try to go into detail on the story of how this came about, but because I know that the curiosity of our listeners has been piqued by your alluding to it, there was a small breakfast meeting where the new president of Earth Charter and our administrative assistant and Jim and I were there talking about this new initiative called Our Children's Trust. And it was clear to us around that table at that very moment that this initiative was so important. It had the seeds of being a game changer in all that we valued, that we needed somebody who would head it up. We needed a staff member that would be dedicated to it. And so I just boldly and almost spontaneously turned to Jim and I said, Jim, how about you? And Jim, who unbeknownst to me had been wrestling with this question of how he could exercise his emerging new passion for this topic, he said, yeah, maybe so. I'd be interested. And so that started us on a journey of figuring out how we could raise the money and bring Jim on board, and how he would make a gracious departure from a job that he has loved and has been respected for here in Central Indiana with the Nouveau News Magazine for a number of years. And here we are tonight, well into his new job. And I think, Jim, what I'd like to have you talk about for a few minutes now would be this initiative called Our Children's Trust, and how that came about, and what is the strategy behind this? How do you see it unfolding?
Sure. Well, you really put your finger on it, John, because it really was this specific initiative that it had ignited my passion. About a year and a half ago, while searching for stories for the Apocadox Project, I found a headline that said 14-year-old girl sues governor. This was a story that came out of a daily paper in Kansas, and it was a story about a 14-year-old girl who was suing the governor because he wasn't protecting her and her generation from the ravages of fossil fuel emissions. Boy, did I get excited about that. I immediately set to research where this came from, and I found an organization in Oregon called Our Children's Trust that John just alluded to. And I did some research on that organization. It was started by a woman who's also a lawyer and a mother. And she had started this organization because she was so alarmed by climate change and the world that her child was going to grow up in that she wanted to do something about it. Further research led me to realize that there were lawsuits or some policy or political dimension to Our Children's Trust in 13 states. Further study, I discovered a federal lawsuit called Kids versus Global Warming. So I got real excited about this. Of course, I had 1,000 things to do every day as part of my work with NUVO and Indiana Living Green, and so didn't exactly put it aside, but it wasn't on the front burner of my consciousness. But I met a young man named Mike Blackwell, a student at IUPUI, a law student, shared the idea with him. He too was ignited in his enthusiasm for it. And pretty soon after that, we realized a law student wasn't enough, and we needed a bona fide lawyer. And after checking with a couple of friends, I was told that Rosemary Spalding was the right person to call. So I called Rosemary. That would have been January of this year, so that's an indication of how quickly this all has unfolded. And Rosemary knew that I was interested in learning how Indiana could get involved with this Our Children's Trust initiative to see if our children, our youth, wanted to step up and do something on a political dimension. And when I mentioned Our Children's Trust to her in our initial phone call, I think I recall her shrieking out loud in joy. It turns out Rosemary had been following this organization for, I think, longer than me. She had great admiration for their project, and she immediately jumped in, and she and I started working together to pursue and investigate and study this initiative. And eventually it became presented to Earth Charter Indiana membership as a program initiative, which the membership enthusiastically embraced, and that was just a few months ago in May. So the idea here in Indiana, because we don't have a provision in our Constitution that deals with public trust that we could actually sue the governor, the idea here in Indiana that we would do what's called a petition for rulemaking, and perhaps certainly in another webinar in 2014 when we're further down the road with this, we can be a lot more specific about what that process is. Suffice to say that a petition for rulemaking presented to the Environmental Rules Board, an agency in state government, could eventually end up on the desk of the Attorney General and the governor, with the main idea being that what we are requesting, what we are saying we absolutely urgently need in Indiana is a climate change action plan. 38 states in the United States have a climate change action plan, 12 do not. Indiana is one of those states, and we strongly believe that our state legislature, our leaders in Indiana need to reckon with the reality of climate change and start to come up with a plan to adapt, to mitigate, to reduce fossil fuel emissions by some percentage each year, a reasonable goal. Let's get started on making Indiana a safer place for our children. Let's get started on trying to lead. There are a lot of Midwestern states, in fact, Iowa is generating over 20% of its energy from wind. I think Indiana might be in the 2% realm. So I don't want to get too far afield here. The Our Children's Trust initiative is a way to get youth empowered, to have their voice heard, to try and get our leaders into the business of protecting them and their future from fossil fuel emissions and other ecological challenges.
Yeah, Jim, the epiphany for me in this, when I first heard about it and thought about it for a little while because I didn't get it at first. Of course, we always talk about doing things for the children and for the next generation because we realize that they are going to inherit the earth, the legacy that we create. But then it dawned on me that instead of just doing things for the next generation, we have this opportunity to do something with the next generation. And the change of focus, of doing something for and doing something with, was just magical for me. And then as you have reported to us and we have looked into this deeper, we discover that young people, young leaders are ready, are waiting. They do understand the gravity of the moment. They are capable, they are bright, they are ready. They are ready to make their voice heard. Now, of course, not all of them. That's never the case. But there are, many are, more than we realize. We keep bumping into them all the time. And just to hear them express in their own words and from their own experience how they feel about this and how eager they are for all of us to get together and to change the story in Indiana from being a kind of a laggard in some of these things, as you mentioned, Jim, where we still don't have an official climate action plan, but to help Indiana become a leader in climate solutions as a bicentennial legacy, and something that, of course, will go beyond the bicentennial, but at least to be able, at that moment of our 200th birthday as a state, to be able to celebrate the fact that one, we have a climate action plan, that two, we are into it, that we are actually doing it, and we are making some progress, and that whatever people have thought inside and outside Indiana about our capacity or our interest, that it will become clear to all of us that great things are happening in this state, and much of it will be due to the fact that young leaders, teenagers for the most part, will have had a hand in helping to shape the future that they will actually be living in. So that's what got to me, and you mentioned, Jim, the idea of adaptation and prevention or mitigation, I guess is the official word. I realized that this work with young leaders is about both, but it is largely about preventing catastrophic change with an intergenerational education and collaboration campaign. And then the other track will, of course, be continuing to identify models of sustainability that people can look at and get acquainted with and find out what it's like to live in a post-carbon world that is having to cope with the consequences of climate change. So we've got both the model and the movement working together here. We've got adults and children working together here. And gratefully, we are finding colleagues and allies all over Indiana in our colleges and universities. And that's why it is, I'm so grateful tonight that Gabriel Filippelli, who heads up the Earth Science Department at IUPUI here in Indianapolis, is on this webinar with us tonight to talk a little bit about his understanding as a scientist on the whole subject of climate change. We call Professor Filippelli Gabe because he has endeared himself to all the climate activists here as being somebody who is very personable, knowledgeable, and accessible. And that is borne out tonight in the fact that he is actually in Washington, D.C. now on special assignment. He is a senior science advisor and a foreign affairs officer in the Bureau of Oceans, International Environment and Science at the U.S. State Department. And Gabe's background goes back to the University of California, where he got his bachelor's degree, and he got his PhD in earth sciences there as well. And he has now the director of the Center for Urban Health, which is related to the earth sciences here at, in Indianapolis at IUPUI. So he has many publications to his credit, and he has become a spokesperson for many of us on the subject of climate change. So Gabe, thank you for making time for this. I know that you're sort of on leave, but it seems like with this new technology we can still communicate across the miles. So we welcome you to this webinar and invite you to share with us your take on climate change from the perspective of a climate scientist.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, and John and Jim, thank you so much for thinking about me for this, and thank you, of course, to all the attendees and eventual listeners. And in a sense, I'm a bit abashed because part of me says, well, we don't really need science anymore, in the sense that, as I'll explain in a second, we understand so much of the science of climate change. We really need people like you guys and our children who have common sense and a concern about the future. That's where we really need to transition the quote-unquote climate change debate, which has proven not to be it's a debate from one side. It's not a debate from the scientific side, apparently. So just briefly, people who've lived in Indiana for a while, I've only lived here since 1994. I'm not a born and bred Hoosier like Jim, but I have experienced changing climate here in Indiana firsthand. And remember, weather is what we feel today. Climate's what we can expect to feel next year and the year after that. So we always have hot spells and cold spells. But boy, I'll tell you, when I first moved to Indiana from California, the first 5 years, I thought, boy, this place is cold. When winters were typically, you'd have several days where it wouldn't get above 0 as the high. We have not had that over the last decade. In fact, each of the last 3 decades in Indiana and globally has been hotter than the one before. And it simply plays out the experiment I could show you in my lab, which is when you add a gas that warms the planet, like carbon dioxide, to the atmosphere at a great rate, you warm the planet. It's wonderfully not rocket science. What is more complicated are some of the broader impacts, and that's actually what I've been working on in the State Department. Is we're very concerned in the State Department, especially in my office, which is Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs, about impacts of global warming on people's livelihood, on the coastlines and the water supplies of small, low-lying island nations, of course. We're worried about severe loss of polar ice sheets, which are bringing some extreme disadvantages for indigenous peoples, yet are bringing some opportunities for shipping and increased potential exploitation of the oil fields up in the Arctic Ocean with its own issues. And we're also concerned about ocean acidification. So this process where warming is one thing, where the greenhouse gases are warming the planet by a very measurable amount. Some of that warmth is taken up by the oceans. But the oceans don't just take up temperature, they also take up this carbon dioxide, this emission from fossil fuels that ends up mixing with the water and turning the water slightly more acidic. And when you add acid to water, you can dissolve things and make life less habitable for organisms in large ecosystems like our coral reefs and certain small plant organisms, which then ripple up the food chain, of course, and cause tremendous impacts farther out. So what's very interesting is very concerning to me, and I think then I'll turn it over to you guys next, is that I just walked over here from a briefing, an actual policy briefing at the American Academy for the Advancement of Sciences. It was moderated by Richard Harris of NPR, I'm a total fan of Richard Harris. The subject was global energy future in 2040. What will we look like from 2040? Not in terms of climate change, but in terms of what our global energy portfolio and balance will be. And it is shocking to see how little voices like ours are heard globally when you see these projections, which is that although the developed countries will be relatively flat in terms of our energy needs, the developing countries will more than double their fossil fuel consumption and demands by 2040. So by 2040, and these are analysts, our U.S. energy analysts, these are analysts from the World Bank. By 2040, we will still rely 75% on fossil fuels for our energy. That's the projections. What I'm telling, and we were told that will be supported by our ability to extract even more coal, natural gas, and oil from the earth and burn it and put it up in our atmosphere in the form of these planet-changing emissions of carbon dioxide. So what strikes me is that's what the analysts are telling us. So I guess my call for all of us, and obviously this is what drives your passion, John and Jim, is let's change that analysis. The analysts aren't wanting it to look like that in 2040. They're just simply analyzing the data and guessing that's what it's going to look like. These are smart people who are using data. Let's change that curve. Let's change it, and the only way to change it is by action, and the only way to make action is to educate people about what are not only the realities and the horrors of climate change, but what are the solutions that are at our fingertips. So that's all I have to say for now, John and Jim, although I'm happy to chat about other topics as they come up.
Well, yeah,
well, that is want to... That's excuse me, kind of a discouraging forecast in a way, and yet I've just been reading today some materials from various places that suggest maybe a different path. I've been reading the fact that prestigious research groups are noting that solar is just exploding. Solar energy is exploding. The growth of clean and renewable energy is seems to be on the march right now, and almost making fossil fuels so old and so stodgy that I think it's going to be difficult for investors to really invest in that source of energy. But so I hope that what you reported there, Gabe, is can be changed, and that we can pick up on some of these currents of enlightenment that seem to be emerging around the country. I wonder how you feel about it, Jim.
Well, you certainly are pointing out some great things. I noted Iowa earlier. There's a lot of good news. Once you start looking for anything, you can find it. But I think beyond that kind of motivated reasoning and the so-called bubble that we live in, you start to see more and more indication that there's a lot of awakening going on. Even if in our home state there's a bit of a lag. We do tend to lag behind and let other people lead, but Gabe is throwing out some pretty scary timing numbers. The 2040 number, of course, that's all the more reason to get kids involved in advocating for their future now rather than later. Now, we did have a massive report come out, the first of 3 stages of a report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, was out. From my perspective, there was a whole bunch of news about this for about 3 days. And then it's kind of been quiet ever since then. I don't know how you gentlemen felt about that, but I did want to make sure, since we do have a climate scientist in conversation, that we talk about this new report that came out. And perhaps, Gabe, you could do a quick description of what the IPCC is and what were its main conclusions.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and I'm glad you referenced that. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN-empowered panel, which has really, for the last 20 years, been looking at global trends. They don't do research themselves, but they are comprised of scientists who cull through the literature, the actual data, and provide some snapshots into what's happening with our temperature, what's happening with human responses, what's happening to sea level, so that they can start making projections about what will happen in the future. And I think the most profound thing, Jim, and it does surprise me that it was in the news for all of 3 days, is that they came up with, this is why I began this with, well, I don't know if scientists are needed anymore. The reason why is that they came up with a figure, which is that they are now have a 95% confidence that global warming is occurring and that it is human produced. Now, what that equates to, the 95% confidence, is the same level of confidence that scientists have and health officials have now that smoking cigarettes for over 10 years can substantially increase your risks of cancer. Meaning that for a normal human being, you better bank that humans are causing climate change, and therefore you better then take the corollary, which is that if we are causing climate change, we can actually take the steps and the action to reduce climate change because we know what's causing it. I'm not saying that we can stop it or reverse it, unfortunately, even in our lifetime. We have simply put up too much carbon into the atmosphere, and it will take a while to percolate its way out. In fact, we're unfortunately already a little over halfway toward what's considered a tipping point in our climate, where we start losing substantial amounts of, for example, polar ice and Arctic ice, which will cause large increases in sea level, which have, of course, risks for coastal areas. So, yeah, this was the first part of this this particular assessment, and it's basically the summary of it, and it clearly states that no matter what people read in the quote-unquote media or hear on the radio, you hear anything that says there's a large debate about climate change, whether it's occurring, whether scientists are in agreement. Well, that debate is not among scientists. That debate is among somebody who might have some vested interest or somebody who is not reading. But that's no longer, that's what the 95% says. No, don't look to the science, throw it to the scientists to say there's a grand debate. The debate's over. And I think what you're speaking to and what John was speaking to is, let's find a way so that the analysts are wrong. Let's find a way that we can use the science to say, all right, let's pivot on this and not focus on a fallacious, now proven to be fallacious debate. Let's focus on solutions to a very simple problem. Let's get sources of CO2 and other climate change producing gases out of our lifestyle. Let's reduce them. Let's figure out ways to produce electricity, which we really do need, and means of transportation, which we really do need, without depending on our atmosphere as an open sewer for greenhouse gases.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. As I understand it, this fifth report by the International Panel on Climate Change did in fact confirm some of their previous models that they had extended out there, that that we are on a course of disaster in a way, unless we make changes, that the climate change dynamics are accelerating. Let me also just pause here just a minute to say to those of you who are listening in, we would welcome your questions, and you probably won't be able to ask a question if you are on your telephone, but if you are sitting in front of your monitor, you could type a question in the chat box. And I'm seeing a message here in my own chat box from Kathy suggesting that there are several of you that do have questions, and maybe this would be a good time for Kathy, for you to read what those questions are, and then we can decide which one of us would be the best person to answer if the questioner does not direct his question or her question directly to Gabe or Jim or myself. So Kathy, what is one of the questions that has come in so far?
Okay, we have a question from Charlotte Wolf. She is asking if there's a link to the analysis that Gabe mentioned, the one about the 2040 prediction of energy use. If that's something that's available on a website somewhere that we could reference, that would be a great thing to share. And I don't know that he would have that at the ready, but we could certainly, follow up with that with the recording of this webinar. If it is available, though, we could put it out for people as a resource. And let me just go ahead and ask a more regular question. This one is from Stephen Strode from Cedar Lake, and he is directing it toward Gabe. Can you tell us what the State Department's current position is on the Keystone Pipeline, and if you think it will be approved?
Excellent question. This is Gabe. I can only report exactly what you guys probably read, and only because I have not, that's not in our direct. Oddly enough, the State Department group that worked on that was the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. I will tell you that the State Department's analysis was restricted to one question only, and that is, would the pipeline through the U.S. increase, does it have a likelihood of increasing or making it more straightforward to produce oil from the tar sands of Canada and thus increase carbon emissions? The State Department analysis indicated that no, it would make it no more likely than if they didn't build it through the U.S., meaning it had zero-sum climate impacts. Now that's the State Department view. Just as a way of interest, and this is also common knowledge, the State Department is actually assessing how it did that review. There are some significant questions about whether it was done even with the right question being asked. So you will hear more about this in the future. But for now, that was their analysis, and I think they are second-guessing their analysis.
Thank you, Gabe. Kathy, is there another question?
Yes, we've got several questions. They're starting to roll. Question from Eric Stahlsmith in Fishers. He is asking, the oil companies are out proving reserves and capping them for later use. So much of this forecast is based on ready-to-roll wells versus what we could discover and drill. So I'm sorry, he said, so how much of this forecast is based on ready-to-roll wells versus what we could discover and drill? Does that make sense?
It does, in fact, and oddly, one of the panel members that I was at today was ExxonMobil production analyst. And there's two categories, and it's an excellent question because it's speaking to what's called, I don't know the exact terms, technologically feasible reserves versus economically feasible reserves. It's something like that. And frankly, the 2040 assessment has this not even touching the technologically feasible reserves. It's just simply talking about the fact that we can, sometimes at great environmental costs, but we can certainly now have economically viable technologies to extract, certainly to extract natural gas from from rocks in the subsurface. We have the technology to get oil from deeper and harder targets and still make it very, very economic. Meaning that there's still trouble ahead in the sense that fossil fuel producing sources like oil, natural gas, and coal are still very easy to get at, and they will be for a while.
Great. And then these next two questions, they're targeting different levels of politicians, but one question that came from Paul, so how do we get our governor or other Indiana politicians to be proactive and understanding about the urgency of climate change or action? And then a question from Wendy in Evansville asked, what level of concern about climate change do you sense there are at higher levels in Washington? So interesting. They can't see each other's questions, but those two came in at almost the same time. So I guess just how do we get through to our political leaders to let them know this is something we care about?
This is Jim. I think having kids get involved in the conversation is a terrific way to reach our leaders, our legislators. I actually received a question in here. I'm looking at a computer monitor myself and got an email from Jane in Terre Haute, who is asking me who is the main contact for our Children's Trust, and I would say that is me, and that what I am specifically looking for right now are kids who are ready to give voice to their concerns and ready to be inspiring to adults. And getting a hold of me at earthcharterindiana.org, Jim Poyser, JIMPOYSER, at earthcharterindiana.org. I'm sure that email link can be attached to the webinar as well. Really looking for kids who get it, whose parents also get it. I'm not interested in getting into a family squabble here. So I'm real interested in the other part of that question about what Gabe senses there in Washington, D.C.
Well, again, I think that that most of the decisions in this town seem to be run lately on money, and this is it seems as if we have no real of national will or ability to do much in terms of national energy policy yet, and I don't see it happening in D.C. any time soon, largely because oil and natural gas as commodities and coal are cheap, quote-unquote cheap, if you don't count their actual environmental costs. So until we fold environmental costs into them, or these what they call externalities, we will get nowhere beyond increased efficiency. Now, here's one thing. I sound like a pessimist. I'm not actually. I'm a horrible optimist. But the one thing that I do see has changed, and I can speak better because I've been doing this for a while in DC. Is the conversation, the scope of the conversation is a lot different now. I do not see as often as frequently that our lawmakers do not even believe, quote unquote, in climate change. I'm seeing them taking a much more practical approach to this, but they're not hearing an outcry from their states to make big changes. We're not hearing Senator Coates and Donnelly are not hearing people from Indiana saying, oh, we don't care if we have to pay X percent more as an energy tax if we will adopt an emission standard for our state. If there are more people saying we will pay more to make our state cleaner, we'll pay more to get rid of dirty coal, they will respond.
Well, I'd like to chime in here to say that I believe you're absolutely right on that, Gabe, and that puts the onus back up on us as citizens of Indiana to make our voice better heard. And I think that rallies like the one that is going to be staged down in the south steps of the Capitol building on Saturday from 10 to noon will be one good way for us to do that. Rallies don't accomplish everything, but they do make visible some of the passions that we have as citizens. So there are things like that that people can get involved in, and there's a website called IN Climate Collaboration that you can go to, and there's a calendar there that reveals a number of opportunities coming up in the near future. I'm also aware of voices out there that are saying, quite apart from environmental concerns, strictly on the basis of economics, that clean energy is becoming much more viable. And particularly if you count the cost that the fossil fuel industry creates in terms of health and in terms of extreme climate, or I should say weather events, and the cost of recovery, 2/3 of which is paid by taxpayers. I think we're starting to get a clearer picture of the actual economics of this thing, and when you get that, coal, gas, and oil just really don't look very good at all. They look like a pretty poor investment. Of course, the people that are making tons of money from these investments want us to believe otherwise. They want us to believe that we just simply can't get along without them, that everything would collapse, and I think we've got to find ways to counter that story with evidence that new sources of energy are in fact quite affordable and a lot healthier for the planet and for our children. You will, let's see, are there any other questions, Kathy, that have come online since?
Yes, there is one comment that I think is quite relevant, and then one more question. Comment from Amanda, who is a principal of a school up here in Northwest Indiana. She says that she has several presentations created by 6th through 8th graders with various target audiences in mind. They're designed for kindergartners through 2nd grade, 3rd through 5th, 6th through 8th, high school, and adults that focus on global climate change. They created the projects in pairs as an assignment for her class, but they've asked her to share them with environmental educators to share with others. So if anybody is interested in them, and I'm sure we are, please let her know, and she'd be happy to share the links. So Amanda, unbeknownst to you, I had just shared your contact info with both Jim and John earlier today. So she was already on the contacts I shared as somebody that you should know who is involved in teaching environmental curriculum. So in any case, they have presented them to their parents, and the parents told her that they had no idea it was an issue. So she was very shocked. Okay, now we've got a couple of other questions that have to do with economics. One from Charlotte, who asks, if decisions are being made on money, based on money, is there a way to monetize the solutions? And I guess we've kind of touched on that a little bit. And then Eric's got a somewhat related question. If you eliminated the subsidies on coal, gas, and oil, and you factored in 10% of the pollution externalities, then would you see that renewables are far cheaper?
This is Gabe.
You want to take that, Gabe, or Jim?
Yeah, I'll just take a little piece of it, and then I'll let Jim wrap it up. It is exactly right, the comment that if we add what we call the true full cost of these energy sources, coal becomes uneconomic compared to wind and solar. Gas, well, I'll get to gasoline in just a second, and natural gas is probably co-equal, although we still don't really understand the true extent of what the environmental impacts of fracking really are, and they might be worse than we even think they are. So again, if we add these externalities, then it paints a very different energy picture and very different energy choices, along with what John had mentioned. Now, the one tricky part is the only way to add those in is via policy, basically a polluter's policy saying you can't do this anymore, or through a carbon tax. And countries have been a little bit hesitant to do either one of those, and those are easy pushes to try to make. I mean, we finally succeeded with increasing these energy fuel standards for cars. We need to do the same thing with having the current EPA rules about treating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, to have them monetized, which they're not currently. The other little bit is we still have one little tricky part, which is our transportation system, which Jim, I think, could speak to quite eloquently. But it's dependent. The global system is dependent largely on liquid gasoline, and unlike the power grid, we've built an entire transportation industry that's for personal transportation that largely has not a lot of easy substitutes to phase in, let's say, tomorrow.
Well, fine. Thank you, Gabe, for that answer. Jim, you want to chime in here and maybe answer one of those questions, or just express whatever hope you have for the future?
Sure. Well, out of time. Sure. Thanks for all those questions. And Eric, those were a couple of great questions. And again, I'm sitting here at my keyboard. I've gotten another email in from Charlotte. I saw that. Very excited to hear about the efforts all over the state in terms of educating kids. So I feel like this webinar is going to create some new connections for me and some new opportunities for Indiana youth. So I'm super excited about that. As to that most recent question, I would direct your attention to ClimateWire, the E&E publishing entity, whoever that is. I found this story on Midwest Energy News, which is a news service I subscribe to. It's all about energy. And gentlemen and Kathy and all the listeners, there's lots of great news that comes through that portal, Midwest Energy News. You sign up for it and get it in your email. But to this point, if you search engine, I don't use the word Google as a verb, if you search engine the social cost of coal, you'll find probably numerous stories, but one in particular by Daniel Cusick, C-U-S-I-C-K, and it's a pretty exhaustive study done by the journal, published in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences, that says that when you calculate everything, renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuel. It's pretty exciting, because that's the kind of conversation you can have with people who distrust your motives, think you're an environmentalist, a tree hugger, or whatever. Get into the economical conversation armed with this kind of information, and you might have a more productive time.
All right. Well, we're going to draw this to a close now. I want to thank all of you who tuned in. I want to thank Kathy Sipple, who has made the arrangements, is recording this webinar. And Kathy, would you just say before we close up here tonight where people can access the recording or tell their friends about the recording if they were not able to be on the call?
Yes, absolutely. I will process the video, and that will be available within the next 24 hours. I will email it to everybody who has registered for this event, a link to it, I should say, and then it will also be posted on our Facebook page. We're looking for a more permanent home on our website where we can put this webinar as along with past archives, because we're starting to accumulate some really good, valuable information. So it will also be eventually available on our website, just not exactly sure where. The best thing I can tell you is look for that email, and then if you can help us by sharing that link, with your Facebook friends or tweeting it or whatever other ways you've got to get the word out, that would be much, much appreciated. And there's just one final comment I think is very relevant from Stephen Strode. He said, just a reminder about the Climate Reality Project's 24 hours of reality starting tomorrow at 1 p.m. Central. So I'm not a big TV watcher. I don't know, Stephen, if you could tell us, is that on a particular station?
The web stream.
Web stream, okay.
It's a live web stream from around the world. Thank you so much for that comment, Stephen. A live web stream from around the world of what it is costing humans to suffer the consequences of carbon pollution.
Great.
Please,
that seems really relevant.
Online.
And Stephen, or Jim, do you know, is there a particular URL that I can take a look at to sample from that throughout the day, put on our
Yes,
probably
climaterealityproject.org is what I'm guessing.
Okay.
Again, you can search into that and find that pretty quickly, I think. That's Al Gore is the leader of that organization, and where I took my training, the slideshows that I present.
Okay, great. And Amanda, the principal who mentioned that she had the students that put together the presentations, she okayed me sharing her contact info, so I did put that out in the chat. But if people would like it, if you're just listening in and you can't see that, her number is 808-292-7030. That's her mobile number. And let's see if I've still got her email posted. And Paul, thank you, he helpfully posted the link for that streaming information for tomorrow. That is 24hoursofreality.org. So that's great. And I will do my best to summarize the key points of this webinar with links and all of that. That will be posted on our website eventually as well, though probably not within the next 24 hours. I'll do my best. Thank you so much for allowing us to be a part of this. I think this is just great conversation. So thank you to all the presenters.
Deep thanks to you, Gabe, and deep thanks to you, Jim. And again, to all the listeners and to you, Kathy. And let's all pull together to make something stunning happen in Indianapolis, Indiana, I mean, and so that maybe the world will take some inspiration from what we're able to accomplish in the Hoosier State. So good night. Keep tuned for future webinars on various topics that we think are relevant and of interest to people like yourselves.